On the scorched red soil of Arizona, where dust settled over rock like the ashes of forgotten memory, a low wooden cabin crouched beneath the shadow of withered yucca. Its roof sagged with age, the walls cracked, the chimney tilted like a broken finger pointing at the sky. Every morning when the pale light brushed across the stony ridge, a thin ribbon of smoke climbed from that chimney, the only sign that someone still lived there. Ezra Culver sat on the splintered porch step, his leather coat worn at the shoulders, silver hair tied at the nape with a strip of old hide. His face bore the weathered marks of time, carved deep like a blade's trace. The creases around his eyes were etched by sun and silence. One hand held a tin cup of coffee, thumb slowly tracing its rim. He didn't drink. The coffee, like most things in his life, had long gone cold. Only his eyes still held to the horizon, where red earth met gray cloud. What once was a home had become only shelter. The cattle shed stood empty, one corner caved in after last year's storm. 5 scrawny chickens remained, only one still laying, but Ezra no longer checked. No one needed the eggs. He had lived here nearly 20 years, 10 of them alive, the other 10 merely enduring. Like wind trapped in a sealed room, he touched nothing, left no trace. His wife had passed. No children, no letters. The townfolk down the mountain had long forgotten his name. Above the fireplace sat a black and white photograph of a woman with her hair pinned low and a soft, slanted smile, faded now by time. Ezra didn't touch the frame. He only wiped away the dust with a rag, slow and careful, as if anything more would shatter what little remained. On the wall hung a Springfield rifle, empty of rounds. It was decoration now, and one he hadn't the heart to take down. Every Sunday he wiped it clean. Not because he needed to, but because he feared forgetting who he had once been. A soldier who had crossed battlefields, gathered the dead, and left behind what could not be saved. Each morning he lit the stove, brewed bitter coffee, and placed the cup beside the photograph. Some days he looked into those eyes in the frame as if asking, "What am I still here for?" But the silence gave no answer. When it rained, water dripped from the roof into a rusted basin. Ezra would sit and listen to it fall, like counting the years he had gone unheard. No one called his name. No one asked if he'd eaten. Only his old horse, Buck, still followed him to the creek each evening. Not because they were going anywhere, but because both needed a reason to keep walking. But one summer noon, when desert wind whipped red dust like lashes across cracked ground, he stood beside the well, pulling up the water pail. The wind carried something strange, not burning grass, not wild animal. It was the scent of dried blood. And breath. He narrowed his eyes, shaded them with his hand. There, by the edge of the well, a small, laying figure lay crumpled, nearly swallowed by the red earth like an unhealed wound. Not an animal, a girl, her hair matted, clothes torn, arms curled tightly as if trying to hold herself together. Ezra stood still. The wind screamed past his ears as if daring him to move. His hand reached for the gun, but his feet were already moving, slow but steady, as if some long-buried part of him had just heard its name spoken aloud. Ezra's steps were slow but heavy. The desert wind still dragged across the ground, kicking up thin ribbons of red dust like smoke rising from old embers. He passed the worn-down porch, the narrow gap between broken crates and a sagging fence. The wind crept down his collar, but he didn't pull it tight. His eyes stayed fixed on the well, where that small figure still hadn't moved. Every step pressed down on something older than himself. Memory. He had walked over dozens of bodies. At Wounded Mesa, the year he turned 33, his unit was ordered to clear out the Apache slums to make way for the trade route. They called it a pacification effort, but when he and 10 others herded the people out from their canvas shelters, they found no rifles. Only children, women, An old blind man still holding a little boy's hand. The commanding officer ordered the tents burned, said they might be hiding gunpowder. When the flames rose, Ezra had been the last one standing. The others walked away quickly without a backward glance. After that day, no more promotions came. No one asked why he suddenly requested discharge in the middle of winter when the war was still grinding on. No one wanted the reasons of a man too tired to explain. He came back to this barren land, locked away his rifle, built a shack, and tried to live like he'd never worn the uniform. But the past doesn't need to be spoken to remain alive. One night, 11 years ago, while digging holes for fruit trees behind the cabin, he struck something in the earth. A small cloth, hand-dyed, stained with blood. Someone must have dropped it while fleeing. He didn't burn it, he kept it. That was the last time he allowed himself to cry. The iron chest beneath the floorboards, latched with a rusted lock, held everything he didn't want to remember. That cloth, his old service tags, and a shattered piece of mirror he used to carry when his wife was still alive. Now and then he opened it, not to look, just to remind himself. I still remember. These days, when he saw Apache folks traveling the highway below the mountain, he averted his gaze. Not out of fear they'd know who he was, but because he no longer had the right to look at them as an innocent man. He stepped closer to the well. The sand shifted beneath his boots. His heart beat hard, not from age, but because he already knew. Whoever lay there wouldn't just be a stranger. And when the figure came into focus, bare feet coated in dust, a torn piece of what had once been a traditional Apache dress, long black hair matted with blood, something rose in him, an old fire, an old night, a child he hadn't saved. He stopped short. His hand fell from the gun grip. His heart, parched and hollowed by time, felt suddenly doused in ice. He didn't know who the girl was, didn't know what had happened, but he knew exactly where he was standing, at the same kind of crossroads he'd turned away from once before. This time, he couldn't. The old fury rose, but not at the world, at himself. And the only thing he could do was kneel slowly, heavily, and reach out a trembling hand to touch her wrist. She was alive, and this time, he wouldn't let her die. In the desert noon, there was no shade, only root-shaped cracks etched across the dry ground. The wind cut like a thin blade, slicing across the cheek, the sleeve, even carving its way into memory. Sunlight washed over every surface, erasing edges and lines, so that the small body lying by the well looked more like a mirage, lost somewhere between dream and reality. Ezra stood there, not touching her, not yet. He had seen the dead before. Swollen corpses riddled with bullets, eyes wide and colorless, hands broken but still clutching charred dolls. But this was a living body, barely. He looked at the girl as if he were staring down a mistake that had never been named. The wind lifted her hair, revealing the back of her neck, where a dark bruise spread like something left by a boot. Dried blood crusted along her forehead. Her dress was torn, caked in red dirt and thorned leaves. No weapon, no shoes, no water. Ezra knelt, one knee in the dirt, the other bent to brace him. The movement was familiar, once used to steady his aim. Now it was to search for a pulse. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed her wrist, not from age, from fear that he'd find nothing. But he did. Faint, but there. She was breathing. Her chest rose and fell so gently it was near invisible, unless the light passed over her at just the right angle. Just a girl, he thought, but dared not speak it. Words would only shatter what little still held. He backed half a step, as if tugged by something inside himself. His hand brushed the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he didn't draw it. Reflex, no one else was around. No threat here but her. But sometimes the wounded are the most dangerous, not because they mean harm, but because they force others to choose between safety and humanity. A sudden gust snapped at the edge of her dress. The cloth lifted, revealing a series of shallow cuts along her hip, repeating, deliberate, like letters, or a mark. Ezra didn't understand the meaning, but he knew this wasn't from a fall. Someone had done this, on purpose, each stroke laid with intent, like carving words into flesh. The girl stirred slightly, just enough for her lips to twitch. No sound, only a flicker in her muscles, like a person dreaming of falling. Ezra felt his throat dry out. Not from fear, but from the old rage surfacing again. It had no target now, just ache, familiar. The last time he'd seen a native girl collapse like this was at Dry Creek, and then he had stepped back. He hadn't reached, hadn't saved, just passed by. A coward wrapped in law and silence. Now that old fury returned, but shapeless. Only him, and her, and a crossroads. One step back and it would all end. No one would know. She'd vanish into the dust. History would fall silent again. Or he drew in a slow breath. Gently, he unshouldered his rifle and laid it in the dirt, like removing armor. Then he bent down, slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. He lifted her, and was struck by how light she felt, like a fawn abandoned in the thorns. The air around them fell quiet, save for the faint rustle of his coat as he turned. His boots began to move. Each step into the dust felt like treading through the cracks in himself. Dust kicked up behind his heels, slow, solemn, leaving behind footprints pressed deep into the red earth like an unspoken vow. This time he would not walk past anyone. Ezra ducked low as he stepped through the doorway, as if afraid the desert wind behind him might shatter the silence that had just cracked open inside his chest. The girl lay in his arms, so light she felt more like a doll of worn cloth than flesh and blood. Limpio, weightless, undefined. But the smell of blood was still there, warm, real. The cabin held only one room, a heavy oak table, a stone hearth, a splintered wooden chair, and a single bed. Her bed. Ezra froze. His eyes stopped at the dark brown wool blanket still stretched across the mattress. He hadn't touched that bed since the day he buried his wife. Every night after, he'd taken to the chair, or not slept at all. He stepped forward and lowered the girl onto the mattress with the careful motion of a man who had once carried bodies and feared repeating it. She whimpered faintly, the sound of wind passing through cracked lips. Her eyes stayed shut, brow furrowed, lips dry and split like spring earth before rain. He fetched the oil lamp. The flickering light fell across her face, revealing bruises blooming from her temple down to her jaw, like the imprint of a hand that had seized and crushed. Ezra's brow tightened, not from disgust, but from pain. The kind of pain a man feels when he's seen such things before, and kept silent. He filled a wooden basin with water from the bucket near the door. The well water was cold, cold enough to rinse blood, but not to sting. He soaked a frayed cotton cloth, wrung it gently, then began wiping the wounds on her wrist. Each stroke uncovered more cuts, bits of dirt, scraps of torn fabric. He didn't ask anything, didn't expect her to speak. This wasn't a moment for questions or justice. It was one person tending to another, the way he'd once wished someone had done for a girl long ago when he had failed to reach her in time. From the cupboard he pulled out a roll of white cloth, the kind his wife used when her joints ached, and a bottle of the worst whiskey he owned, kept only for sterilizing livestock wounds. Each time he soaked the cotton, his hand trembled, not from the liquor, but because he hadn't touched another person's skin since the day she died. The girl's eyes opened slightly, just a sliver, pupils dark as jet, glinting beneath the lamplight. No fear, no recognition, just a moment suspended between two souls who'd both been left behind. Ezra nodded, a silent greeting. She murmured something in Apache. He didn't understand, but he nodded again, as if the only thing needed now was presence, not words. When her hands were bandaged, he pulled the old wool blanket over her chest. The gesture was so familiar it ached. It had been the last thing he'd done for his wife. Cover her gently, straighten the edge, then retreat to the chair and watch. He sat again, in that same wooden chair. His rifle rested across his thighs. The lamp cast a wavering glow, throwing his shadow across the wall, like the outline of a guilt that never left its post. He sat there all night, unmoving, listening only to her faint breathing and the wind whispering through the eaves. A night without dreams, and none were needed, because everything he'd once feared to remember had walked through his door. Afamatu, morning fog blanketed the Arizona desert like a gray shroud, cold and clinging to red earth and jagged stone like rusted blades. The first light hadn't yet cut through, only faint streaks slipped through, dull and thin, like the last breath of an oil lamp before it dies. Ezra woke before dawn, not from habit, not from the wind or bird song, but from a sound that didn't belong, not the familiar whistle of desert gusts, not the chirp of the lone sparrow nesting near the roof. It was hooves, many, steady, like war drums echoing from beyond the veil of fog. He rose, leather coat brushing his sides as he moved toward the porch. His hand found the Winchester, thumb grazing the cartridge latch with the ease of a man who'd once survived by instinct and steel. His eyes scanned the pale mist until shapes began to take form, riders, moving slow, silent, drawn in charcoal lines against a graying sky. No one shouted, no warning shots, only the quiet tightening of a ring around his cabin, like ghosts who already knew their mark. Ezra counted 15, then 20. They positioned themselves by the well, under the dead yucca trees, atop the ridge. Eyes sharp as arrows, nocked and ready. Inside, the girl stirred. Bare feet touched cold floorboards. She stepped to the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, eyes wide as the scene before her became clear. Her lips parted. One word escaped. Koa. Ezra turned. Her breath caught sharp and quick, like that name had reached into a place she'd buried deep. He didn't ask, just placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Out in the mist, an older man stepped forward, salt and pepper hair tied low, a leather coat etched with Apache symbols. The chieftain. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. His eyes were flint, cold, sharp, unwilling to yield. Beside him, a younger man sat tall in the saddle, jaw set, hands clenched around the reins as if holding back a vow. Her brother, Ezra guessed, by the way his gaze never left her. "Send her out," the chieftain said, voice low, like a stone dropping into a deep, still well. Not a threat, not a plea, an order. The girl stepped back, clutching the edge of her blanket. Ezra said nothing. He stepped onto the porch, placed himself between the door and the fog. His rifle was low, but his hand never left it. Mist curled around his boots, circling like it too wasn't sure which side of life or death this moment belonged to. The young man shifted atop his horse. His eyes flickered between worry and flame. "Ayana," he whispered, voice rasping like wind over stone. She heard him, but she didn't move. Her gaze turned to Ezra, asking silently, "What will you do?" He didn't speak. He just stood there, between her and the world, like a man long used to standing at the edge of choices no one wants to make. But this time, he knew he wasn't going to walk away. The wooden door remained shut, but Ezra felt it tremble in rhythm with the ground beneath him. No one outside stepped forward. No voices called, no fists pounded wood, only presence, heavy as stone. Not a threat, but a reclamation. A quiet, immovable force that had come to take back what was once theirs. Ezra stood near the window, rifle cradled at his waist, finger hovering, never touching the trigger. Wind slipped through the gaps in the wall, carrying the scent of saddle leather, sun-warmed hide, and old ash. He didn't think he feared death. Death had shared his home for years now, in the shape of a wife who no longer spoke, no longer breathed, but seeing himself reflected in another's eyes again. That he feared. Seeing what he had been, what he might still be. Behind him the bed creaked. The girl was trying to sit up, one hand braced against the window frame, trembling, but her eyes were no longer lost. She looked through the mist, lips pressed tight, then turned to him and placed a hand on his arm. No plea, no word, just touch. Ezra looked down at that hand, thin, marked with half-healed cuts, skin darkened by sun, nails chipped and dusted with grit, but it clung to him like someone clings to the last ledge of breath. For a brief second, something returned, a night, a burned tent, a little Apache girl hiding in the corner, staring at him with the same eyes, not crying, not screaming, just staring, an accusation wrapped in silence. That night he'd turned away, but now he stayed. Ezra whispered, each word like gravel torn from the throat. "They'll want you back, or your blood." The girl nodded, no resistance, as if she already knew. Then slowly she placed her other hand on his rifle and shook her head, not to stop him, but to say, "Don't start that for me." The wind stirred again. The photograph of his wife on the table tilted slightly. He turned. The frame had slipped. She still smiled, that soft, slanted smile, her head cocked gently, but now even farther away. Ezra walked to the corner cabinet. He pulled down the only scarf that hadn't been torn or eaten by years. Deep chestnut brown, black trim. It had been hers, his wife's, worn during their first winters at the ranch. He'd never used it, just left it hanging from a wooden peg, like a breath of her still lingered there. For the first time he unhooked it. No words. He simply draped it over the girl's shoulders, carefully covering the torn fabric over her chest, then tied it in the back, slow and hesitant, like handing over a piece of memory older than himself. The girl leaned slightly toward him. No embrace, no tears, just stood there, quiet, steady, like the shadow of a tree settling beside the shape of a mountain. Ezra turned, walking back to the door. His hand found the wooden latch, but he didn't pull it. That door, once opened, would never close the same way again. But if it remained shut, would he still be a man? Atop the high ridge overlooking Ezra's roof, a single rider broke from the line. Alone, calm, majestic in stillness. The man on horseback wore a dark leather coat, cross-strapped across his chest. His long hair was tied low behind his neck. He drew no gun, unsheathed no blade. He simply rode downward, posture straight as if the earth itself were a knife's edge, and he, the one holding its hilt. At the outer line of the fence, no further, he stopped. The wind caught his coat, lifting it enough to reveal the carving on his belt, the emblem of the Chiricahua Apache. Inside, Ezra stood behind the door. He heard the hooves halt, then heard the voice, deep, firm, shaped more like command than threat. "Send out the girl, and may you live," a sentence sharp as gunfire. No hatred in it, no heat, just judgment. In the cabin, no one moved. The girl stood behind Ezra, clutching the scarf around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the window, on the space where her past and its blood stood waiting. Ezra's hand gripped the rifle, not to shoot, but to steady the trembling, not from fear of dying, but from the weight of what this choice would take. If he stepped forward now, he would not return as the same man. Then, a small shift. The girl turned slightly, and the movement shifted the blanket on her shoulder. Light from the door's crack struck across her side, and Ezra saw the cuts, not random, not from falling, not scraped by brush or stone, They were deliberate, ordered, marked with purpose, like ritual, like branding. And suddenly he knew. She hadn't fled from her people. She had fled those who wore the masks of warriors, but acted like beasts. She was a survivor from the very place meant to protect her. Ezra's chest tightened. All the years he had lived quietly, burying memory by refusing to name it, now rushed forward like a flood through a broken dam. Dry Creek. The girl he didn't save. The bloodied handkerchief folded in his iron chest. The look in his wife's eyes before they closed forever, as if asking, "This time, what will you do?" Ezra slowly turned toward the girl. She was already watching him. No begging, no tears, but in her eyes, everything he had ever tried to forget. "She's not going back." The words never reached his lips. No one would hear, but they landed inside him like a fist against the heart. He turned toward the door. Slow, deliberate, each movement drawn out like the last taut strand keeping him tethered to what made him human. He didn't open the door, not yet, but the choice had been made, and the wind outside seemed to know it too. The fog still clung to the red land, like a whisper, not yet ready to leave. Pale morning light crept over the roofline, casting a long shadow of Ezra. Standing firm before the door, his hand gripped the rifle stock, but his finger never touched the trigger, as if he knew this moment didn't need a bullet to say what he had chosen. From the slope, a lone rider broke loose, not aggressive, but urgent. A young man with high-tied hair and a dark deerskin coat vaulted off his horse and ran straight toward the cabin. His eyes didn't register Ezra. They searched only for the girl behind the doorway. "Ayana!" he shouted, voice hoarse, ripping through the fog like a blade. The girl trembled. Bare feet stepped to the threshold, fingers clutching the wool blanket at her chest. Her eyes widened, as if sunlight had returned after a long, cold dream. "Tella," she whispered, voice choked but steady, the name of her brother, the only soul she once believed might still come for her. They collided in the dust, arms thrown around one another, Sela gripping her shoulders like he feared she might disappear. Ayana pressed her face into his chest, not crying but breathing like someone who had finally remembered how. Ezra stood back, lowered his rifle, didn't interrupt. He was only witness, like the wood plank walls around them, keepers of truths no one ever spoke aloud. But the circle outside did not break. A younger warrior rode forward, scar sliced clean across his nose, eyes sharp as obsidian. He fixed them on Ezra, like aiming blame at a wound still open. "You," he said, low but cutting, "you brought her shame." Ayana stepped forward, pulled away from her brother. The wind caught her hair, sweeping it back to reveal the bruise on her brow. Fading but not forgotten, she raised her arm, pointed at the scarred warrior, and spoke in Apache, fast, hard, like hammers cracking granite. No one translated, but Ezra understood. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't asking, she was defining, redrawing her own line in the sand. Behind her, Tsela laid a hand on her shoulder, his eyes heavy with pride and pain. He glanced at the scarred man and gave a slow shake of his head, as if to say, "Don't make her say it again." The warrior said nothing, his lips pressed into a line. He didn't argue, but his stare stayed cold, like a promise left hanging. Ezra stepped forward. He stood beside Ayana, didn't speak. He laid the rifle on the ground, not as surrender, but as a declaration. "I'm here, not to win, but for her." Ayana turned to him, and her eyes were no longer the eyes of someone saved. They burned, quiet, steady, like a small fire rekindled in the chill of the desert. And in that moment, in the fog and red dust, Ezra knew he hadn't just held his finger from the trigger. He had held on to something far greater, a trust that didn't need gunfire to be made real. The sky turned toward dusk. The sun no longer burned, but the air thickened, like something long held back was ready to break. And then he came. An older man rode forward from the rear ranks. Not in war dress, just a worn leather coat, inlaid with silver too faded to gleam. His hair long and streaked with gray, his spine unbent, his gaze deep as an old well carved into desert stone. The chieftain, her father, the one everyone had been waiting for, whether they said so or not. His horse moved slow. No signal was given, no word spoken, but every warrior he passed dipped their head, just a little, as if wind alone had commanded them. Ezra stepped out to the porch. He didn't retreat, didn't advance. He had walked past corpses in his life, had faced the end of men and battles. But now there was only one set of eyes he could not look away from. The chieftain halted his horse a few paces off, studied him, then spoke, in English, clear, hard, like stone breaking on steel. "You touched her?" One sentence, no excess, no visible fury, but beneath it, a world balanced between life and death. Ezra gave a slow nod. Only to stop the bleeding. Ayanna stepped forward, her fingers clinging to the edge of his coat like it anchored her to solid ground. She no longer shook, but her breath still carried weight. She looked up, met her father's eyes, and began to speak, her voice in Apache. Soft at first, then faster, choked, urgent, like a river once dammed, now breaking through. No one interrupted, no one dared. The chieftain said nothing, didn't blink, didn't shift, but the air around him seemed to collapse inward, as if even the wind held its breath. Then a sound, barely audible, like sand sliding across stone. He exhaled and nodded slowly, deeply, then said, "You saved my daughter. That makes you part of our storm." The words were strange, but in them a recognition, a bond, a crossing of a line no one expected to be crossed. No one clapped, no cheers, but the circle loosened, quietly, naturally, as if a current had shifted under the dust. Ayanna remained beside Ezra. No tears fell, but her eyes shimmered. She placed a hand gently on his chest, right over the place that for so long had been nothing but silence. That night the ranch sat still, as if every sound had been caught at the edge of the dark, held back by something deeper than silence. Ezra stood at the threshold, firelight from the stove casting its flicker across the lined side of his face. Inside, Ayanna slept under the old wool blanket, her head resting on a shirt his wife once stitched, its threads worn thin. Outside, the breath of horses, bootsteps of sentries pacing slow, the scent of smoke and tanned hide braided into the wind. The chieftain approached. No blade, no escort, just a man, a father, or perhaps simply another soul who had lived long enough to be quiet. He sat on a log near the fire pit, eyes turned to the stars. Time passed. Then, in a voice low and grainy, "They'll keep coming. Others like the ones who took her." No elaboration, no weight added. Ezra understood. This world wasn't a wound to be stitched. It was poison in the riverbed, seeped in. Old, deep. "We ride tomorrow. You can ride with us." No command, no plea, only a space offered. Ezra didn't answer, not then. But when he stepped inside the cabin, his hand found the trap door in the floor, and beneath it, an old cedar chest, still locked. The key lay behind his wife's faded portrait. He opened it. Inside, things no one else remembered: a battlefield map, a silver badge dulled by time, a strip of blood-stained baby cloth, and a torn patch of embroidered fabric, once ripped from his wife's blouse to bandage a child he hadn't saved. A thing he never spoke of, a thing he never forgot. Ezra folded the cloth, placed it in a small pouch, tied with leather cord. He didn't take his rifle, just a knife at the belt, and a coil of old rope. Tomorrow he would ride, not for redemption, but because he would no longer stay behind. Part 11. The road with no way back. Emotion, tight restraint, acceptance, a bond beyond words. Dawn split open across the ridge like a pink gash torn into the dusty sky. No one spoke. No one needed to. The riders moved in silence, crossing dry prairie and blood-stained stone, threading through trails known only to the Apache. Ayanna rode behind a warrior, her eyes fixed forward, but her hand gripped something in her palm. A folded piece of cloth Ezra had given her. Ezra rode his gray horse, an old beast that no longer raced but never quit. The reins were rough, the saddle worn. He carried only a water flask and the knife at his belt. The wind came head-on. The scent of scorched grass and sweat mingled in the dry air. No one asked why he rode. And Ezra never asked where they were taking him, only hoofbeats, the scatter of stones, the call of a lone bird lost in a sky that seemed to reject every traveler beneath it. By noon, they stopped beneath the shade of a low-thorned tree. Ayanna approached and held out a prickly pear, its spines already stripped away. Ezra took it, bit into the pulp, chewed slowly. She said, "Not all white men die bad." He nodded, didn't smile, just nodded. A moment later, as his hand rested on the knife hilt out of habit, Ayanna spoke again, quieter. "Some die good." This time, Ezra smiled. The first in years. A crooked, cracked thing. Like the dry earth learning how to bend without breaking. "Let's find out which one I'll be." Then they rode on. Ahead lay a narrow path, cut through ragged stone. Like the dry throat of this land growling a warning about what was coming, there was no way back. And for Ezra, there didn't need to be. Dawn split open across the ridge like a pink gash torn into the dusty sky. No one spoke. No one needed to. The riders moved in silence, crossing dry prairie and blood-stained stone, threading through trails known only to the Apache. Ayanna rode behind a warrior, her eyes fixed forward, but her hand gripped something in her palm, a folded piece of cloth Ezra had given her. Ezra rode his gray horse, an old beast that no longer raced but never quit. The reins were rough, the saddle worn. He carried only a water flask and the knife at his belt. The wind came head-on. The scent of scorched grass and sweat mingled in the dry air. No one asked why he rode, and Ezra never asked where they were taking him. Only hoofbeats, the scatter of stones, the call of a lone bird lost in a sky that seemed to reject every traveler beneath it. By noon they stopped beneath the shade of a low-thorned tree. Ayanna approached and held out a prickly pear, its spines already stripped away. Ezra took it, bit into the pulp, chewed slowly. She said, "Not all white men die bad." He nodded, didn't smile, just nodded. A moment later, as his hand rested on the knife hilt out of habit, Ayanna spoke again, quieter. "Some die good." This time, Ezra smiled, the first in years. A crooked, cracked thing like the dry earth learning how to bend without breaking. "Let's find out which one I'll be." Then they rode on. Ahead lay a narrow path, cut through ragged stone. Like the dry throat of this land growling a warning about what was coming, there was no way back. And for Ezra, there didn't need to be. Dawn broke over the narrow valley like ash falling from a cold fire. The light was pale, dim, spilling over filthy canvas tents and makeshift corrals cobbled from rusted stakes. Wind swept red dust into the air, veiling the sound of children's cries swallowed within cages of steel. Ezra crouched behind a rock outcrop, his weather-worn coat caked with grit, both hands clenched tight around his Winchester. Beside him, Ayanna lay prone, a small revolver steady in her grip, her eyes sharp, unflinching. No longer the gaze of someone running. Tisela, her brother, knelt behind a thorn bush, knife in hand, his glance flickering between fierce resolve and the fear of losing her again. The chieftain raised one hand, a sharp signal swift as a hawk's cry slicing through stone. And then it all erupted, not in screams but in motion, dust and bodies descending like a blade splitting the earth. Ezra charged through the haze, firing measured shots into the silhouettes near the cages. A tent flap burst open. Inside, 3 children, wrists red and raw from rope. He dropped to his knees, cut them free with his dagger, and pulled them behind him. A man lunged, knife flashing. Ezra turned, swinging the rifle stock hard into the attacker's shoulder, sending him sprawling into the sand. Ayanna, just a few paces away, spotted another man dragging a little girl toward the corral. She ran, fell, rose again, raised her pistol. The bullet snapped through the air, striking the man's arm, forcing him to release the child. Ayanna pulled the girl into her arms, murmuring in Apache, her voice low, alive, burning, not with vengeance, but with the flame of life reclaimed. Sela broke through a corner of the camp, cutting bonds from 2 women, his blade sure, his hands shaking as he embraced them. Sela, one whispered, as if summoning back a name from a memory he thought long buried. The valley vanished in dust, the light flashing in slivers like blades. Ezra stumbled as a body collided with him, but rose, dragging another child from the cage. No longer a soldier, no longer a man seeking pardon, just a man doing the one thing that still made sense. The right thing. And then the gunfire ceased. The valley fell silent. Survivors were lifted into wagons. Children clung to one another. No one cheered. Victory wasn't joy, just a chance to breathe. Ezra sat beside a collapsed tent, shirt torn at the shoulder, breathing hard, his body frayed, but not broken. Ayanna approached, her eyes never leaving him. She placed her hand over his, small, strong, a promise made without a single sound. Sela stood nearby, watching them both. He gave a small nod. No words, but his gaze had shifted from suspicion to trust. And in that moment, amid the red dust and faded light, Ezra understood. He hadn't just saved lives, he had saved himself, with a hand that never let go. Morning arrived with a colorless light, no pink, no gold, just the gray-hushed glow of a land that had bled, and people who no longer ran. Smoke from the morning fire coiled upward like a prayer no one dared to say aloud. The woods beyond still held the damp breath of night. Ash and scorched iron lingered on the wind, mingling with the steady stomp of horses and dirt. The surviving Apache moved about camp, tending wounds, gathering gear, each person busy but none in haste. Ezra stood near a pine, its top snapped long ago. His face was lined deeper now, creased by smoke, by years, by whatever had just passed. His left sleeve was torn, a shallow bullet graze along his arm. But he stood straight, his back ached, but something in him had lightened. The chieftain approached, a man whose face seemed carved from flint by 1,000 winters. He didn't smile, didn't speak right away. He simply stood before Ezra, looking at him, long and steady. Then he placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder, a quiet touch, but deeper than any medal, any pardon, anything Ezra had once thought he needed. His voice came dry and sure, like steel against stone. "Now you are brother." Ayanna stepped beside them. In her hands she held a bracelet, woven from leather cord, small bone pieces and polished red stones. She placed it into his palm, "To remember who you became." There were no drums, no songs, no ritual, only the silence between people who had seen each other clearly. In ways no judgment, no confession ever could. The people began to depart. They rode not toward the sun, but away from it, back toward their village, toward wood-built homes and souls still waiting. Ezra didn't follow. He stood alone, watching their figures shrink into the forest's edge. In his hand, the bracelet, on his shirt, dried blood, and in his eyes, a light he hadn't carried in over 10 years. He knew someone out there was alive because he had stayed, and that was enough. The little wooden house still stood there, alone in the red dust, like a question that never needed answering. Wind passed through the broken roof of the old cattle shed, pulling a tin sheet into its rusted song. And on the porch Ezra Culver sat, just as he had on all the mornings before, cradling a tin cup of black coffee, his hands as hard and gnarled as oak roots pressed into the floorboards. Steam rose from the coffee, mingling with the slow, reluctant sunlight. It wasn't a good day, wasn't a bad one either, just a day. The kind that tells you someone is still here. Inside, everything remained as it had been. His wife's embroidered cloth still hung by the stove, faded but whole. The oil lamp still sat on the windowsill, its wick never replaced. But one thing was new. On the kitchen wall, beside the old photo of his wife, a charcoal sketch had been pinned. A girl, hair unruly, eyes turned sideways, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The lines were rough, the shape imperfect, but it was enough to remember. Next to it, Ayana's bracelet hung silently. Each time the wind crept through the doorframe, the small bones clicked together, like whispers never meant to be answered. And then, when the sound of hooves echoed from the far ridge, unhurried, unthreatening, he didn't rise. He only tilted his head slightly, gazing toward the trail that led to the borderlands. And after a long, still breath, he said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, just loud enough for the wind to hear, "Still here?"